After 23 years in provincial politics, Dalton McGuinty will call it quits today. The former Ontario Premier will resign as MPP for the riding of Ottawa South. McGuinty had promised to stay on as MPP until the next election, but has only been in the legislature twice since Kathleen Wynne was elected Premier. Speaking to CTV Morning Live earlier today, Ottawa Centre MPP Yasser Naqvi reacted to McGuinty's pending resignation.
Obviously, we can't speculate as to what Mr. McGuinty will say in the statement, but what I can say with certainty that he has been a strong leader for Ontario.
The Liberal Riding Association in Ottawa South has scheduled a nomination meeting for June 20th. Prime Minister Stephen Harper is in London today ahead of this week's G8 summit. This morning, he met with oil, gas and mining executives where he announced Canada is adopting a G8 initiative which will require companies to disclose payments they make to foreign governments. Here's CTV's Danielle Hamamdjian from London.
As is the case every year, there is a theme to this year's G8 summit, and that is trade, tax and transparency. And so on Stephen Harper's first full day here in Europe, he pledged more transparency in the extractive industry. In other words, for oil, mining and gas industries, companies that is. Just to give you an idea of just how significant this is, 60% of the world's mining companies are listed in Canada. 35% of the world's oil and gas companies are listed in Canada. Around the world, more than half of the mining activities from Canadian companies. And so this plan means that it would be mandatory for these companies to report just how much money they pay in taxes to the local governments. What it means for citizens of these resource-rich countries, they'd be able to hold their governments to account. Now, this initiative may not be enough to impress the host of this year's G8 summit, David Cameron. There has been some concern among insiders with knowledge of the G8 summit talks that Stephen Harper has not been all that supportive of some of the initiatives, especially when it comes to tax evasion. No doubt a big topic of discussion when both leaders meet tomorrow. Danielle Hamamdjian, CTV News, London.
Auditor General Michael Ferguson insists he has free rein to examine all Senate expenses. The Senate called in Ferguson to look at the Chamber's expenses and even expenses claimed by individual senators. Appearing before a Senate committee, Ferguson said his team is now in an extensive planning process to determine which parts of the Senate to look at and just how many senators will have their expenses reviewed. But it could be at least 18 months before the investigation is complete. Police and protesters retrenched this morning after overnight clashes in Istanbul's Taksim Square. The lull in fighting comes as Turkey's prime minister prepares for meetings aimed at ending the anti-government protests. Yesterday, police fired tear gas and rubber bullets in a bid to disperse the crowd. The protests have become the prime minister's biggest challenge since he came to power a decade ago. And Nelson Mandela remains in hospital for a 5th day. The South African president calls Mandela's situation very serious, but adds he has stabilized. The 94-year-old was hospitalized on Saturday for a recurring lung infection. 2 of Mandela's daughters and his former wife visited the hospital today.